So I drew an illustration here on the board so you guys can get a visual of what I'm speaking about. But it's basically when you exceed the critical angle of attack between the chord line and the relative wind. So the relative wind is always opposite of the flight path. The plane is going this way, like so. The relative wind is going the opposite direction. And so you have wind that's going through the across the airfoil. You have high pressure on top. You have high pressure below and low pressure on top. Sorry, and typically a stall occurs when you're typically around anything above 15 degrees. So I would say between 15 and 17 degrees, you're going to end up stalling the aircraft because what happens is the air is just disrupted to the point where it can't get below the wing, and it's not sufficient. You don't have a sufficient amount of lift being created by the angle between the core line, which is the line from the root of the wing all the way to the end, and the relative wind. So there's the angle. So right here I have a one for 12 degrees, and up here I have for 17 degrees. And if you can see, I'm going to draw some wind right here. Majority of the wind is getting above the wing and not equally distributed to get under the wing as it should, because it should be an equal distribution. So power stalls are practiced to simulate stalls and approaching the landing phase, and it's done in a landing configuration with flaps and landing gear. So why do we practice the stalls? So we practice stalls to really improve the recognition and recovery of a stall, and to immediately prevent loss of control of the aircraft. So it's very imperative that stalls can happen at any airspeed. Stalls can happen, at any attitude, whether you're climbing, descending, turning. So it's imperative that we learn and we teach students how to recover from stalls, especially in critical phases of flight of takeoff and landing. So what we're simulating is a landing scenario when we practice power off stalls once again. So really by helping them to develop the skills, understanding the stall characteristics of the airplane that's being flown, and be able to recognize the cues to prevent that potentially dangerous situation from happening. So we go ahead and do that. Like I said, it happens in the critical phases of flight, which is approach to landing and takeoff, but we're practicing power off stalls for its approach to landing. So it's important that the student understands how to avoid them and how to recover from them. And I'm going to break that down in a bit. All right. So first things first is a stall. The loss of lift due to separation of the airflow over the wings brought on by exceeding the critical angle of attack. And stall is, like I said, stall is going to create any airspeed, altitude, and power setting. And we have two types of stalls regarding that maneuver, which is imminent stalls, and that's when the aircraft is approaching a stall, and it gives you the buffet, it gives you the warning signs, it gives you the horn, and so forth. Your controls get mushy, and you don't really have that control effectiveness as you would if in normal flight. But at that point, you haven't exceeded the angle of attack. The aircraft is providing you with cues. It's like the aircraft's language saying, "Hey, you're exceeding the angle of attack, or you're getting close to it," and it tells you, if you're looking at your airspeed, you're going to see the airspeed bleeding off and getting very low. When you're practicing power out stalls, it's an indication. A full stall can occur if you exceed the angle of attack and the nose ends up dropping below to break the stall. So how do we practice for a power off stall? We have to select the proper altitude so that the maneuver can be completed no less than 1500 AGL. Then we do clearing turns. So a clearing turn everyone has a specific way of doing their clearing turns. I prefer to do a 90-degree turn to the left, look up, down, out, and around, and a 90-degree turn back to the right, looking the opposite direction to make sure that I do a full, basically 90 degrees, come back and look around. Some people do a 360, some people do a 180 from north to south, come back from south to north. I usually just do 90-degree turns in each direction, and that helps you to clear the area up above, down, and around. Another thing you want to do is scan for outside references. You're going to verify your altimeter setting. you're gonna verify your altimeter, your airspeed, your heading, and your compass. And you want to constantly make sure that you establish yourself appropriately for the heading. So in the ACS, you gotta get plus or minus 100 and plus or minus 10 knots for the private, and plus or minus 50 when you're doing slow flight, when you're entering slow flight for the ACS commercial exam. So you want to, do your clearing turns, pick a suitable altitude. I usually go up to like 3,000 or so, like that. So I usually go up anywhere between 3,000 feet. Right, so I pick a suitable altitude, let's say 3,000 feet. That way it gives me enough sufficient altitude to break the stall and to recover before I get down to 1,500 feet. Then you're gonna do your clearing turns. After you do your clearing turns, you want to select the heading, and I like to pick either any cardinal heading. So let's say I'm flying north, 360, and you get plus or minus 10 degrees on that one, and on the altitude you get plus or minus 100 for that maneuver right there. Actually, when you begin the maneuver for Purdue standards, you're not allowed to descend below the altitude that you initially started from. But in the power off approach, you're going to end up descending to establish a glide at 66. So yes, you are. Make that correction right quick. You're going to keep your hand on the throttle unless you're changing aircraft or engine configurations and really trim. So then you're going to, once you establish your altitude, you do your clearing turns, you establish the heading that you're going to use, you want to start reducing your power, establishing a glide at 66 knots. So you're going to pull your power to about 1,500, or based on the temperature of the day. 1,500 usually does the trick. You're going to pull power. Pull your power to 1,500 RPM. And then you're going to establish a glide at 66 knots. You want to let your airspeed bleed off until you get to about 66 knots. And what's going to happen is, once you get down to establish 66 knots, the way I go about doing the power off stall is I bring the nose to the horizon and just allow the airspeed to continue to bleed off. And once I get below VFE, let me actually correct that. Once I pull the power, once I get below VFE, which is 102 knots, once you get below 102 knots, you can start incrementally putting the flaps in. I just put full flaps in at that point, and allow the speed to bleed off. Then I establish a glide at 66 knots. Once you get the glide, you raise the nose to the horizon, and just hold it there level. And I usually just trim to allow the nose to hold the altitude at that point. After I establish that 66 knots, so I'm trimming, keeping the nose at the horizon, and the airspeed is going to bleed off because I have to now hold. What the trim is doing is it's holding an angle of attack that is not sufficient to really help you maintain lift, or the airspeed is you don't have enough power to help you maintain the amount of the vertical component of lift that you want to maintain. So the airspeed is bleeding off because at 1,500 it's very hard to hold that altitude. So you're having to, instead of fighting the plane and trying to increase the pitch, just hold it at the horizon, trim it out, and the airspeed will bleed off naturally. And so that's after you add your flaps and whatnot. You establish your glide at 66, establish a descending glide at 66 knots, and using your rudder to stay coordinated. So what you're going to use is your rudder to help you maintain that plus or minus 10 degrees from either left or right side. So just trying to hold north. Use your rudder because when you're into a slow flight configuration, the plane wants to have the tendency to yaw because you have left turning tendencies, and these are very prominent at low airspeeds. So use your rudder to help you maintain coordination and maintain the heading that you want to fly. And then once you establish yourself at 66, then you're gonna power idle to maintain your descent. And then you're gonna increase back pressure on the yoke, and that's what I was talking about when you just bring it to the horizon. Naturally, the stall will occur because it's holding level attitude, but it's at a higher angle of attack to where it's gonna end up exceeding the critical angle of attack and stalling. So once you get to that point where you start to feel the controls getting shaky and whatnot, and you get the stall horn, that you're going to announce imminent stall, and that's what happens. So either you can hold the yoke there, or you can trim and just let the plane enter the stall by itself. I don't recommend trying to force yourself to pitch up into hold altitude, because you're just going to fight the plane. That's not what you want to do. To recover, what you're going to do is simply drop the nose or release back pressure on the yoke, and allow the plane to break the critical angle of attack. And what you're doing by that is you have this airfoil right here, and you have an angle right here from the cord line. So at first, when you're in the stall, you exceed the critical angle of attack, which is usually between 15 to 17 degrees. When you drop the nose, you're now having a shallower angle, and now you're probably around 10 degrees or 12 degrees or something like that. And that's a good angle of attack to allow you to create enough airspeed or to break the stall. So you reduce in order to recover, you're going to simply reduce the angle of attack by dropping the nose, by releasing back pressure on the elevator and breaking the stall. And you want to lose as minimum amount of altitude as possible. So using right rudder to stay coordinated, and you're going to apply full power. So as soon as you break the stall, you're going to go full power, and you want to start raising the nose upward, right? So you break the stall. Once you break the stall, it's a very back-to-back action. You lower the nose, you break the stall, apply full power, bring the nose upward. You're going to use your aileron to roll bank neutral. If you are bank, sometimes an examiner or a flight instructor might tell you to bank 30 degrees or 10 degrees left or 10 degrees right, or whatever the case may be. So if after you break your stall, the plane's going to automatically won't have the tendency to want to bank either left or right if you're not really taking control properly. So always hold the yoke properly, maintain control. Use your rudders to stay coordinated, and coordination in a stall is very, very important. Use your rudders for everything, because if you don't use your rudders and you end up banking the plane and the wings are stalled, you're going to end up into a spin, which is not what you want. Very, very dangerous. It's very dangerous if you don't know how to correct it, and if you're not at an altitude that is sufficient for you to be able to recover in a decent amount of time. Once you've applied full power, you've maintained coordination, you level the wings out, you want to roll your ailerons neutral and retract the flaps. So I incrementally retract the flaps gradually. So after I break the stall, I apply full power, I level the wings, I'm staying coordinated. I'm waiting for the airspeed to build up from anywhere between high 60s into 70s, and I would remove the first notch of flaps. So from 30 degrees to 25 degrees. And then once the airspeed gets above VY 76, then I start retracting the last 2 notches of flaps incrementally and return on to whatever specified heading, airspeed, and altitude that I was, and I would complete the cruise checklist or climb checklist I'm climbing out. Which actually, so you want to establish a climb after you've broken the stall. So after you break the stall, you apply full power, remove the flaps, you want to establish a climb at 76. And then once you've established yourself in a decent climb attitude, then you can go ahead and set yourself up for a cruise flight, untrim what you've trimmed, and do the appropriate checklist for that. Some of the cues that you guys need to be looking for are the stall warning horn or a change in airflow. If you can look at the wing, you can see that the wings start to buffet and shake like so. So those are some of the cues. Also, if you look on the attitude indicator, if you realize that you're anywhere between 15 and 17 degrees of pitch up, you have a high tendency of stalling the aircraft. Other ones are buffering and, like I said, mushy controls. Some of the adjustments for non-standard conditions is if the aircraft is overweight, then your stall speed is going to increase. So instead of you stalling at, let's say 50 knots, if you're overweight, you're going to probably end up stalling at 60 or 65 or something like that, a higher airspeed than usual. Also, if you have a CG that is very far aft, your stall speed decreases. So it's going to stall at a slower airspeed than you think it would. If you have a forward CG, then your stall speed is going to increase. So instead of stalling at 45 or 50 knots, it might going to stall at probably high 50s or like mid 60s or something like that in terms of knots. And also high density altitude days, your stall speed is going to increase. So whenever the density of the air is at very high, then your stall speed is going to increase because there's less particles, there's less air molecules in the air per volume. And so what the airplane is thinking is basically that they have to increase the angle of attack to maintain the amount of airflow that's over the wing, because there's less airflow over the wing on high density altitude days. So to the completion standards is for the private applicant, you have to complete no lower than 1500 AGL. So as I usually do that at 3000. Plus or minus 10 on the heading, plus or minus 10 on the bank, no greater than 20. And acknowledge impeding stall, recovering stall, or full stall. Acknowledge that you have an impeding stall and recover with a full stall. With the commercial standards, you're going to have no lower than also 1500 AGL, plus or minus 10, plus or minus 5 on the bank. So the standards get a bit stricter for commercial. And you're also going to acknowledge recovering, full stall, and recovering. Some of the common errors is not really correcting for the torque effect or for the left turning tendency. So you have a lot of P factor, you have a lot of spiral and slipstreams, you have a lot of torque that can occur. So you would recognize that the nose of the aircraft wants to yaw to the left when you have a power change. And like I said, at lower airspeeds, the increase in left turn tendencies occurs. You have an increasing effect of left turn tendencies. Understand also that you're going to have a decreasing control effectiveness as your airspeed decreases. So your controls work best at higher speeds. When you start getting into slow flight, your controls get mushy and it gets very hard to control. Some of the analysis that I want to mention is to analyze your decreasing airspeed and your pitch motion. Be very, very careful and always keep your eye on your airspeed. Because once you see the speed start to bleed down, then you know for a fact you're going to get closer to a stall the more closer you get to the stall speed. And also on recovery, it's very important that you climb out at VY or at VY, which is the best rate of climb to help you to pitch to get out at a safe airspeed. And that pitch attitude of VY is just about a few degrees above the horizon. And that will help you to be able to climb out smoothly and not having to worry about hitting anything, any form of obstacle. Other small little caveats is to understand that whenever you have a stall wing, whenever you have a stall, the warning horn is going to come on a few seconds before the full stall or partial stall. So it's going to give you an indicator to say, hey, I'm getting close to the stall speed, try to break the angle of attack. But some examiners are going to want you to get to the full stall, some will just tell you get to the horn. It just depends on what they want. Look for indication and cues, and the correction for this maneuver has to be very, very abrupt. You can't wait. So the moment that you get the stall, you need to immediately break the stall, lower the angle of attack, apply full power, and then raise the nose back up to a level horizon. And then once airspeed builds up, after you move one notch of flaps, then you should pitch up to a climbing attitude. And that is the lesson for power off stalls.